The 20th century has been described as America's century for world leadership. The 21st century has begun with America's leaders a disappointment to the rest of the world and an embarrassment to its own citizens. For the first time, the field of generational study is in place to present the missing piece that explains how and why our nation once soared to world respect, then crashed downward to disrespect, but why now, today, our nation stands at the front door, hopefully, of a magnificent run of world leadership that is filled with integrity, compassion, and bold vision. The good news about this topic, it is really easy to get. The entire foundation of generational dynamics is based upon three truths, now heavily researched, universally embraced, and yep, easy to understand. Truth number one, between the time that each of us in this theater and in this nation is born and the time that we leave the full-time classroom years and get fully into adulthood, late teens to early 20s, in that formative years window of our lives, you and I are going to mold most of the core values and the core beliefs that we will keep for life. Yes, we'll evolve, we'll change, but those core values will remain largely intact, and they will be burned into us by the times that we witness all around us as we're growing up and by the teachings that we absorb from older generations of parents, educators, religious leaders, and others. And the age group that shares similar formative years times and teachings will by and large end up sharing similar core values. And by sharing the same core values, we become a generation. And any time in American life, either the times or the teachings or both change in a significant way, in a widespread coast-to-coast, top-to-bottom way, it means that young kids coming of age in those different times and teachings will form different core values and become our next generation. Truth number two, and this is why the topic is so hot, life in America in the last century has changed so often. And when it has changed, it seems to have changed so sharply into new directions. And thanks to modern science and medicine, we are now living exactly 30 years longer on average in this country this year than we were 100 years ago. That for the first time in our nation's history, our life expectancy has room for 5 living generations, each of whose formative years were different from the other 4, and so each of whose core values are different from the other 4. And truth number 3 that explains this whole generations thing is what brings it right down to the brutal bottom line of day-to-day living. The unique core values that each generation molds during its unique formative years are now going to exert remarkable influence over that generation's consumer choices, career decisions and career performance, lifestyle preferences, personal and professional relationships, and personal behavior. Here is the starting point of generational study. Say hello to America's 5 living generations. The GI generation, born between the years 1901 and 1926, now fully in their 90s or older. And of those who are still with us, their unique formative years began during the economic prosperity of the roaring 1920s, but were then followed by 16 consecutive years that to probably most of us in this theater are unimaginable. The complete misery and hopelessness of the Great Depression, followed by the unimaginable human slaughter of World War II, in which an estimated 50 million to 75 million people worldwide die. Those unique times, when coupled with the teachings that young GI kids are absorbing as they're coming of age, will burn into them a very long list of unique core values that to this day guide their decision making. The silent generation, born from 1927 to 1945. This generation comes of age largely from the 1930s to the early 60s, an era marked forever by its extreme, and to many silent kids coming of age, suffocating conformity. The baby boomers, that post-World War II population bulge that has been delicately described as the pig moving through the python. Born from 1946 to 1964, the generation whose motto used to be, "Never trust anyone over 30, would now like to revise that a bit. Boomers are now at the oldest end into their 70s. When in the heck did that happen? Generation X, still mysterious, still bewildering, still misunderstood, still overlooked, still underappreciated, sensitive, smart. And now in life, after the most emotionally difficult childhood in American history, starting to hit their stride. Born from 1965 to 1981. And finally, America's next great generation, and they are going to be great, but I assure you right now, they are driving their employers nuts. The Millennials. Do not call us Generation Y. Don't call us Generation Z. Don't call us Generation Next. Don't call us the app generation. We want to be called the Millennials. Wonderfully cocky and sassy. They think they're going to change the world, so they are. For the moment, born from 1982 to 1998. Important point, we do not join a generation until we get out of high school, essentially at age 18. There is no such thing as a 16 or a 12 or an 8-year-old member of any generation, because those K through 12 years are our formative years. It's when we are trying on different core values, deciding which ones fit, which we'll keep, and which ones we'll discard. It is one of the luxuries of youth. We get to change our mind on a whim, and we do. But what we now understand is that when we get out of high school, we have developed a pretty strong set of core values, most of which we're going to keep for life. And so that is when generational study begins, because that is when generational study becomes trustworthy. We do not yet know which year will be the millennial generation's final birth year. And here is what we now understand more deeply than we have ever known it before. Each generation takes its turn at the top of America. The members of that generation, like all of us, begin their careers down there at entry level in early adulthood. The smartest, the hardest working, and the luckiest of them slowly advance through their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, their 60s. And then for about 2 decades, that one generation holds down the overwhelming majority of decision-making positions in American business, government, education, religion, all of our other major institutions, all of our minor ones, in every city of every state. And while they lead, while their one generation so thoroughly dominates the decision-making positions, they methodically install and instill their generation's unique core values, not just throughout their own individual organizations, but collectively by the sheer force of generational dominance throughout all of American life. And then their generation retires and hands that leadership baton to the next generation, whose very different core values will now push America in a different direction. And here is what has been proven so clearly over the last 60 years. Some generations beyond their control pass through their unique formative years absorbing times and teachings that prepare them for very good leadership. Some generations beyond their control pass through very different formative years, times, and teachings that prepare them very poorly for leadership. And we've also learned this from generational study. Any one generation's leadership era begins when the oldest members of that generation reach retirement age, about 65, and the rest of the generation trails down in age through its early 60s, 50s, and usually reaching into their late 40s. And here's where we're heading with this. America has just endured one of the more damaging generational leadership eras in its history, but now stands at the front door, possibly, of a magnificent leadership era as the next generation begins its turn at the top. The silent generation, and especially tiny generation of under 47 million, and that will become very important in a few minutes. Their unique formative years, from the 30s into the early 60s, are marked forever as a time of extreme conformity. Don't rock the boat, do as you're told. Children should be seen and not heard. The white men of this generation have enjoyed the smoothest career passage in American history. The lives of silent generation females have lived and influenced the before and after of the modern women's movement. The lives of silent generation minorities have lived and influenced the before and after of the modern civil rights movement. David Halberstam, a respected white silent generation male, an historian and a journalist, wrote the following words in his acclaimed book entitled The 50s about the corporate culture of General Motors during that decade of the 1950s. Here's what he wrote. The men who ran the corporation were square and proud of it. Loyalty among employees was more important than individual brilliance. Team players were valued more highly than mavericks. The corporation came first. The individual was always subordinated to the greater good of the company. Also in the 1950s, Ray Kroc, a member of the GI generation, in a now famous memo that he sent to the McDonald brothers in California as he was rearranging the entire restaurant industry, wrote this: "We have found out that we cannot trust some people who are nonconformists. We will make conformists out of them in a hurry. You cannot give them an inch. The organization cannot trust the individual. The individual must trust the organization." Try to pass that one off today on a Gen Xer. But in this environment, from those older bosses, the message down to those young, aspiring, silent men is very clear. In the aftermath of World War II, our country is really rolling right now. So conform to the organization's way of doing things. Don't rock the boat. Be absolutely loyal, anything for the company. And if you do all of this, young, white, silent male, your loyalty to the organization will be matched by the organization's loyalty to you, and you will one day be entitled to reward. Well, after 16 very recent years of seeing their own parents and grandparents endure the absolute hell of the Great Depression with its high unemployment, and then the absolute hell of World War II, this new message from the boss sounds absolutely delicious. So the young, white, silent man does all of this. He does work hard. He is loyal. He does it the company way. He subordinates himself to the greater good of the boss and the employer. Very key point, he follows. And he patiently awaits the reward to which the boss has assured him he will one day be entitled. These are the times, these are the teachings imposed upon this generation beyond their control. And because the American economy is soaring just as the silents end high school and enter adulthood, and because silent generation females and silent generation blacks are so brutally and systemically prevented from competing against him for the better jobs and promotions, that white silent male receives that remarkably smooth passage. The silents also come of age during a famously materialistic era in America, the so-called American High of 1946 to 1962. After the war and the Depression, and doing without so many things for so long, suddenly the war ends. Suddenly our economy takes off. Suddenly the American masses have job opportunities, they have cash in their pocket, and so they splurge on this pent-up demand for stuff. And as the best and the brightest and the luckiest of these white silent men so smoothly and rapidly climb the ladder, and as they suddenly receive money and live lives that they know their own parents never had the opportunity to live because of the Depression and because of the war, they come to judge themselves, those who climb to the top, quite literally by the square footage of their office, by how near their office is to the boss, by the cars they drive. Corporate executives drive Cadillacs. Doctors back then drive Buicks. They judge themselves and each other by the furnishings inside the house, the local restaurants they frequent, the vacations they take. This generation of achievers measures its success by its material wealth. These are the times and these are the teachings imposed upon the silent generation beyond their control. In their careers, silents have distinguished themselves in the so-called helping professions, and we need to remember that each generation has its very